just setting. This is why, this is yeah.
Beautiful. Well, it is very, very nice background, and we're just giving a chance for everybody to sign on. We have two audience groups. We have those joining us on Zoom, and they'll be putting comments, I know, in the chat box. This is the way, right, of these webinars. And then we're pushing to Facebook as well. So we'll have a live audience there as well.
Perfect.
So wonderful. Thank you for joining us mid-Pesach. How are your Seders?
Well, it's because people here are all vaccinated, then it was really a different experience than last year in the sense that we had, all of us together celebrating in large groups, and it's really been different than in previous years. So that was in last year. So we had our whole family together, the grandparents, everybody together, happy and celebrating. So yeah, so it really feels liberating.
Oh, I'm sure. It's like redemption in the truest form of the word, right?
Absolutely.
Right on theme. Passover always seems to be on theme. Last year, right, the theme of the plague and disease, right on brand. This year, the theme of redemption and freedom, right? It's really,
exactly.
It's amazing how we're able to stay on theme. I love it. So we'll give everyone, I think, 60 more seconds, and we'll start at 5 after the hour. I've been told that we're live on Facebook now, so I just want to welcome all the Facebook fans that are joining us for what I know is going to be a very interesting educational conversation with my colleague. Rabbi Noah, how do you pronounce your last name?
Sattath.
Sattath. Okay, Sattath.
Yeah.
We were taking some bets earlier, and I definitely lost.
Well, I think that it's most people probably did as it's this is like a Yiddish writing for a Hebrew name. It's very, very complicated.
Right, it's transliterated. It's not English, so
exactly.
Sattath. Exactly. Now I know. I'm going to go to the chat box for 1 second and welcome Sharon, welcome Arden, Karen, Max, all the way from Moscow, Karen, our regulars, Jerry, Eileen. It's just wonderful to see you all, to see your messages pop up. I hope everyone is enjoying their Pesach, and thank you for being with us in the middle of this week. We are so grateful to be having this conversation. I want to welcome everyone joining us on Zoom here with Rabbi Sattath, who is very, very busy, an Israeli colleague who directs the Israeli Religious Action Center, the IRAC. And of course, we're going to talk about what the title of this program is. We're going to talk about the landmark decision today of the Israeli Supreme Court to accept reform and conservative conversions performed in Israel. So my hope is that the rabbi and I will converse for about 30 minutes. We'll see where that goes. And then I want to really hear from you. I want to hear from our audiences, both on Facebook and on Zoom. On Zoom, I'm going to ask, instead of putting questions and comments in the chat, which is really where we just converse and say hello to each other, to go to your Q&A button on the bottom right of your Zoom box. Put the questions there, and that way I can keep track of what we've answered and what we've gotten to. But I want to back up, from this topic and ask, my colleagues, the first time that we're meeting in person here on Zoom. You have a very big job. You are the director of the IRAC, which is the social justice arm of the reform movement in Israel. And for those watching who are familiar with the RAC, the Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., this is the parallel organization in Israel. But for many of our viewers, this is not a familiar organization. So I was wondering, Rabbi, if we can start by you telling us about your work with the organization and what it does and, what you do there and what drew you to this type of work. It'd be very interesting for us to hear that.
Oh, wonderful. So perfect. So I get to steal a little bit of time to tell you about myself.
Absolutely.
So I was born here in Jerusalem to a really, really secular Israeli family. Like, our Shabbat tradition was that my father would go to the non-kosher butcher shop and get bacon, and that's what we did every Shabbat morning. Again,
Wow.
my family's very devoted. They still do that. And what drew me to the rabbinate and to Iraq was social change work. So I was the head of the Jerusalem Open House, which is the LGBT center here in Jerusalem. And I think that Jerusalem is probably the most religious city in the world that has a gay center in it. And that provides many, many interesting challenges and opportunities. And back then it was the only LGBT organization in town. So I got to work with Palestinian lesbians and ultra-Orthodox gay men in every different sector of Jerusalem society that you can imagine. And I really got to witness how religion in general and Judaism in particular can be a destructive force, really ruining people's lives, and how it can be a force for justice and liberation, allowing people to be all that they can be. And I got to see both ends of it. And when I left there, I wanted to look at social justice issues from a broader perspective than the LGBT perspective. So I joined an organization that's called MEET, which was founded in MIT in Boston. And that's an organization that provides extracurricular educational programs for outstanding high school students from Israel and Palestine. And that was also a really interesting experience. And one of my major roles there, one of the major challenges I had to overcome was challenging the reluctance of the Israeli students who were high schoolers, 14 years old, to engage with the Palestinian students. So these were all really, really brilliant children. We chose 20 out of 600 applicants. And despite the fact that MEET, like most encounter programs, has a built-in advantage for Israelis, the Palestinians had to cross checkpoints in order to get there. And we spoke in English, but everybody around us spoke Hebrew. And in computer science, the Israeli education system is really focused on preparation for computer science. And the Palestinian education system is focused on other things entirely. Despite all of these advantages, the Israeli students were petrified of the Palestinians. And the more I looked into it and I brought experts and consultants and I did conversations and workshops, the more it became apparent to me that the Palestinian students came with a really strong narrative, a really strong sense of self, both religiously and nationally. And the brilliant, brilliant Israeli students who all came from secular high schools around Jerusalem, they couldn't articulate anything about their Jewish identity that didn't have to do with the Holocaust. That was the only grounding factor.
Wow.
And I got to witness how people build big walls around themselves when they're not secure on the inside. It's not only about an external threat. And that's what has brought me to an understanding that has really deepened since, that this void in Jewish identity that we as a progressive camp in Israel have has a profound impact, not only on questions like conversion that we will discuss today and marriage and what we do on Shabbat, but also about how we see ourselves and how we see the other and how we think about justice. And that's what really led me to rabbinic school, where I get to think about how we develop a progressive Jewish identity in Israel. And just briefly, we at IRAC are the social justice arm of the Reform movement. And we deal with many different intersections of religion and society. Today, we'll be talking about conversion, which is a very big intersection in Israel, but we also deal with issues like marriage and divorce, gender segregation in the public sphere, racism and the struggle against racism in Israel, and other relevant issues.
So your work sounds so interesting.
It's great. I'm so privileged to be able to do that.
Right. You know, rabbis do so many different things, and, you know, your specialties sound, you know, very broad, as opposed to here, you know, myself, you know, as you know, I'm very lucky to direct the Center for Exploring Judaism here in New York, very large program in New York City that, you know, welcomes people to Judaism. And we deal with the same issues of identity, belonging, adopting narratives. So we do have a nexus. of our work. And about 80% of our students who are interested in Judaism do go on to convert. And of course, when we teach about conversion, we're always very transparent about who will accept their conversion from the center, from Central Synagogue here in the US, and then also in Israel. And my line is always, Israel is a different beast, and here's why. So today's topic was of great interest, to this particular community and to me personally. It got me thinking really that perhaps the Orthodox monopoly in Israel is, being chipped away. And I've always admired the work of Iraq. But I think we need to back up, sort of give our viewers the context for this decision. And I think, if you agree, we could start with what the status quo was in Israel in regards to personal status before this landmark decision. Who was considered a Jew in Israel and who decided that? Will you explain to everyone sort of, this issue of personal status? What was the status quo?
So if you let me, I'll zoom out even a little bit more. So
Sure.
In Israel, there's no separation between religion and state. I know that it feels like in the US sometimes it doesn't either, but in Israel institutionally, there is no separation. And we are using a system that we inherited not from the British Mandate, but from the Ottoman Empire that ruled Israel in the 19th century and early 20th century, in which there are different religious courts that report to the state about different personal status issues. That includes marriage and divorce, and also your religious identification. So the state has a classification of the different religions, and you either belong to one of them or to none of them, but every single citizen has a classification. Specifically about Judaism, the classification is very sensitive, since everybody who's a Jew around the world has the right to come to Israel and claim citizenship, which is one of the wonderful things about Israel. And that was decided upon in 1950 in the law of return, which is a fundamental law in Israel. And the law of return says that a Jewish person is a person who was born to a Jewish mother or who converted. It's a very short law. And since the 70s, we have been debating the question, what it means converted. While we have been representing both the reform movement globally and also the conservative movement in stating that our conversions are part of that, of what the law refers to. In 1989, we won the right for anybody who converts through Central Synagogue to come to Israel and make Aliyah. All of those conversions have been recognized. I want to put a caveat to that. Anybody who converts in Central Synagogue is allowed to come to Israel and claim citizenship. Because of this dual system, the state will recognize the conversion and register the person as Jewish and a citizen, but the rabbinate, the Orthodox monopoly that controls the religious court, will not. So people are welcome to come to Israel, and we will be happy to escort them as they go through the simple legal process of recognition, but they will not be able to get married or divorced in Israel because the rabbinate will not recognize the conversion. And what's been happening since 1989 is that the conversions that you, Rabbi, are doing in New York City are recognized, but the conversions that we as rabbis in Israel have been doing have not been. Even though we both went to HEC, went through the same training, we have the same standards. One could argue that people who are already in Tel Aviv and already speaking Hebrew are, even more natural to become Jewish and citizens than people from New York City. But that's what we've been debating since 2005. We've been in court with our converts, trying to get them to be recognized. And it's been an inspiring Jewish journey for these Jews by choice who so wanted to be Israeli citizens and so wanted to be included and so wanted to be part of the Jewish people and Jewish community. If you'll allow me, I have a 1 minute video. Is that okay? To show of their I just want you to see their faces, and yeah. I'm sure you'll
And
love and admire their Jewish journey the same way that I did.
And while you're queuing up that video, I have to just say to the group, I know, watching hundreds of our students, that, key to the heart of this conversation is about dignity, the dignity of every Jewish person to feel that they belong. And when we have a situation where the Jewish homeland, where it's worse to try to become a Jew in the Jewish homeland than it is in the diaspora, that is an enormous problem. It's a challenge, right? And this is what the Iraq, fights for and advocates for. So let's watch the video. I'm sure we'll have some follow-up.
Can you hear?
התנועה הרפורמית מנהלת עתירות בנוגע לזכות הגיור שלנו בישראל כבר מעל ל-35 שנה. ההחלטה האחרונה חותמת את המסע הארוך הזה.
אני מחכה לזה 10 שנים ויותר. אני רוצה להרגיש שאני 100% חלק מהמדינה, וזהו, זה היה באמת החלום של החיים שלי.
אני כבר כמו ישראלית, אני גרה פה, אני עובדת פה, אני הולכת לבית חולים, אני חולה פה, הכל. אני חושבת אחרי 20 שנה, יש לי מה לבקש קצת.
בית המשפט קבע כי המונופול האורתודוקסי לא יכול להשתלט על תחום הגיור, וכי חוק השבות מגדיר את מדינת ישראל כמדינתו של העם היהודי כולו על כל זרמיו. בג"ץ גם העניק צדק למתגיירים ולמתגיירות שמנהלים את המאבק המפרך הזה כבר מעל ל-15 שנה.
עשיתי גיור רפורמי כי אני הרגשתי שאני יכול להיות יהודי, אבל בדרך שלי.
הרפורמים, אישה וגבר, זה אותו לבל, וזה חשוב מאוד.
היא שמחה על החלטת בג"ץ ומודה לשופטים ולשופטות על ההחלטה האמיצה הזאת, שמוסיפה נדבך נוסף בהכרה של הגיור הרפורמי במדינת ישראל. מזל טוב לכולנו.
So really, I think we all feel that the state of Israel is blessed with these new citizens, and we as a people are blessed to have such devoted people who wanted so much to join our people and join our faith and be part of our community.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And you covered that, the status quo was that only the Orthodox courts had authority over personal status, which of course violates, I believe, Israel's commitment to human dignity for all people. How can there be a policy in Israel, right, which only allows one sect, which is very valid to make decisions. So I appreciate that. Now, you mentioned just now that the idea of this status has been discussed in the Israeli Supreme Court, for over a decade. The specific case that was won, my understanding is, first went to the Supreme Court in 2005. So I would love you to share with us about the particular convert, the particular family, which you advocated for, which was the final turning point that led to this ruling. What was different? Why now?
So we went with one convert from Ukraine, and the converts that you saw, Erika and Alejandro, and a group of other 40 people joined the process as it was progressing. So we actually won for about 40 converts who will all get this right, and there are other people who will get the right, who were not on the list, but who will get that right. So just a highlight of our Supreme Court system, we have 15 Supreme Court justices, but cases are debated in groups of 3. And because citizenship and immigration are such a big issue, they first had a hearing with 3 judges, and then they extended the panel to 7 judges, and then they extended it once more to 9 judges, which is a reflection of how significant the court sees this issue. There are less than 1% of the cases are debated in this kind of forum, which means that it's a really weighty issue. And I think that the judges understood the implications. The government was using fake news and scare tactics, saying, well, if we now open this door, then the reform movement will convert all of Africa, and all of these African refugees will come and settle in Israel. And even though we have a very clear screening method, that was the fear mongering that the state was doing. And the court really urged us and the government to reach an understanding outside of court about our conversions, and we were very open to that dialogue. But for the last 3 years, the state wouldn't dialogue with us, so there were no hearings, and the converts that we were advocating for were waiting. So first they were not deported because the court stopped their deportation, even though it was constantly threatening them. But for example, they were not citizens, so they didn't have health insurance like all Israeli citizens do. So during this time of pandemic, they were without insurance. And I think that was one of the things that pushed the court, that there was no way to continue to discriminate against these people for so long with the constant neglect of the negotiation that the government was demonstrating.
I have often heard the Supreme Court, described in Israel as sort of the line of humanity and decency, right? To push the religious courts to make decisions. So it's interesting that the pandemic, in fact, did this, but it's very interesting about the 9 judges. Now, you mentioned non-Orthodox conversions were already included in the law of return, but that the Orthodox rabbinate doesn't consider them as Jews. So I'm wondering about this ruling, that even for the sake of citizenship, will these new conversions in Israel also not be considered Jewish by the rabbinate? Yes. In other words, is this a symbolic ruling, or is this really going to make a difference?
So it's going to make a huge difference in the same way that the 1989 ruling did, in the sense that these people will now have citizenship and they will enjoy all the rights that all Israeli citizens enjoy, in the same way that all the converts in the Central Synagogue program can come to Israel, claim citizenship, and enjoy all the rights. They will be the same in the sense that the rabbinate will not recognize them and will not marry them. Let me give a quick understanding of what this means. So we were talking about this system of religious courts. In Israel, there is no option for civil marriage. All of our marriages are religious ones. So when I perform a marriage with a ketubah and a chuppah and 7 blessings and everything that you know about a Jewish wedding, that wedding is not recognized in Israel. And then the couple that I marry flies to Cyprus, which is the nearest destination outside of Israel, and also where the second largest industry is marrying Israeli couples, and also Lebanese couples, because Lebanon is also with the same system from the Ottoman Empire, and where the Archbishop of Larnaca marries the couple under a big cross, and that marriage is recognized in Israel. And that's an absurd situation. And it's even worse for divorce, because when a couple chooses to divorce, like 30% of the couples in Israel do, they cannot do that in Cyprus. There's no way to divorce in a place where you don't live. So they have to go through these rabbinic or religious courts. So I think that you were already getting the levels of complexity. So we have this Supreme Court, which is a beacon of human rights. The Chief Justice is a woman. The one who came before her was a woman. The one who came before her was a woman. And under that same system are religious courts that are very, very conservative and traditional. So in the Jewish rabbinic court, all of the judges are Reform or are Orthodox rabbis, who are, of course, men, according to the principles of Jewish law, of halakha. Women cannot testify, so they literally have no voice in front of the court. And the civil divorce, as well as the religious get, the Jewish certificate of divorce, depend completely on the consent of the husband. He could be abusive, he could be in jail, he could be in a coma, he could be in a different country, he could be living with a different woman. The woman doesn't get a divorce until the husband says he agrees to it. In the Sharia, in the Muslim courts in Israel, 19% of Israeli citizens are Muslim. They are more liberal in terms of kind of their place in Muslim law. And they just started nominating women judges 4 years ago. And the women can decide on the divorce even if the husband doesn't agree or is not present. But if the woman wants to remarry, she automatically loses custody of the children. so that's, that closes the path for many women. And in the Catholic courts, there's no divorce, just annulment that has to go through the Vatican, which with average waiting time of 17 years. So the system is completely insane. And many Israelis choose not to get married through that system. Certainly not only Jews by choice, but many Israelis, about 20% of Israelis do not marry through this system because of the reasons that I just listed. But that is still a significant point of discrimination.
Sure, and a significant form of tension between, the civil and religious authorities. Again,
absolutely,
in a land where the dream of Zionism was that all Jews would be welcome in a homeland with equal rights. I mean, for a Jew not to be able to marry another Jew, really goes against what I consider, the spirit and the intention of the original law. And, we have seen, the courts or the rabbinut, when given a chance to become more flexible, more lenient, more loving and inclusive in this sense, we have seen them tighten. I'm thinking specifically of the case of the Russian Aliyah in the 90s, where 300,000 Russian Jews came to Israel, are not considered halachically Jewish, but, over time have now assimilated into, Israeli society. And what is, do you think that the religious Zionists are looking and saying, well, that's the worst case scenario? Or are they looking and saying, well, this is where our hard line got us, right? Now the reform movement is going to step in and give these people a proper conversion path to citizenship. Do you think there's any reflection there? Just because we have this, 20, 30 years now of that population, and now it's the same with the Ethiopian Jews.
I think that the monopolies everywhere in religion, in economics, they resist every option for competition that there is. I mean, they will do anything to prevent competition. And in many senses, for them, these conversions, they would rather keep the hard line than actually meet the needs of the population. And this is, Orthodoxy in Israel, there are very liberal Orthodox organizations and people that we work very closely with and collaborate with. Unfortunately, the rabbinic court, the rabbinic establishment in Israel, is controlled by extremists who are defensive and who are, I think, not recognizing the potential of welcoming new people into Judaism. And what they want to project is there's only one way to be Jewish, right, which is the ultra-Orthodox way. And in that sense, there's only one way to become Jewish, which is the ultra-Orthodox way.
Right. It seems very similar, to here when, there are two camps around conversion. There are the camps that say people who, convert, especially liberally, will never really be Jewish. They're just posturing, etc. We shouldn't waste time and resources on them. Then, of course, the camp of our program of rabbis who share the philosophy that I do is, wow, the intermarriage rate is only going to grow. This is a wonderful reflection of how Jews have been admitted fully into society, because it wasn't always the case that people wanted to marry Jewish and be Jewish. And therefore, there's an enormous opportunity here, to welcome people in, to convert. And, we want our, students to feel like they're walking on a red carpet, toward Judaism. But I think it's always beneficial to try to understand the argument from the other side, even though with extremism it is difficult. Is the narrative of the other side, yes, there's only, one way, but is it a fear of disintegration of Jewish peoplehood? Is it a fear, that ignores the past 300 years of modernity and what has happened in Israel and in North America, especially?
Okay, so I have a video to show. This is a campaign. So I think some of you know that we have had a fourth election last week. It feels like forever ago. And this decision came in the midst of a campaign. the ultra-Orthodox parties who were actually lost votes in this campaign use this in order to incite against us and our converts. So let me show you. It's a little bit offensive, I warn you. This is the rhetoric that we are exposed to. It's a tiny fraction of Israeli society that is using this rhetoric, but I want to share it with you because I want you to see kind of what's going on.
בר מצווה לכלב, אכן תמונות קשות.
I perform bar mitzvahs because it's a blessing for the animals.
בווידאו מיוחד שנערד לכבוד האירוע, הכלב אלוויס קורא מתוך התורה.
השכם בבוקר התקבצו מאות החברות והחברים בתנועות הרפורמיות והקונסרבטיביות בהובלת רבנים ורבות בכניסה לרחבת הכותל, נחושים להתפלל בה בצוותא עם ספרי תורה.
אני רואה את תפקידי לחבר את הקהילה הרפורמית האמריקאית לישראל ולתגבר את הנוכחות הרפורמית ואת התנועה הרפורמית בישראל. אנחנו נכונים על נשמתה של מדינת ישראל.
So you see the context here. So first of all, you see this group that wants to basically undercut the judicial arm of Israel, and they're using this conversion case in order to attack. But also you can see, as you've seen, the fear of any different way and the complete undermining of any conversion that is not done by them. And obviously we reject that, and we have won, and we will continue to bring our Jewish values to this arena where we believe our conversions are, essential to Jewish continuity, and our, the converts who choose to join our people are such an essential part of who we are and who we've always been, and who will continue to be for the future.
100%. Obviously, as your colleague here, as a Reform community, we are in lockstep. That was a very upsetting video. I want to say, in the same breath, that I'm sweating right now, a silent Holocaust, to be the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, that's wildly offensive. But also that I, as a Jew, as a woman, rabbi, as a leader in the Reform movement, I'm so used to the mudslinging and the propaganda that it's very easy for me to file this away in just the nasty, disgusting propaganda that it is. But I'm very glad that you showed it to give us a context of what we're up against. I do want to put it in context. Could you share with us, if you know the demographics of the population of Israel, secular Israelis, Reform, Israelis versus the ultra-Orthodox? What are the numbers or percentages that we're talking about here as part of the population, so we don't get, a blown up perspective?
So first of all, I want to say that this is not representative of all the ultra-Orthodox population. This is the extreme segment of it. And I'm showing it to you because extreme discourse matters and we need to respond to it, but not because it represents all of the ultra-Orthodox society and community. Of course. It does represent some of them. It totally represents some of them. But if we look at the Israeli society, so first of all, 21% of the population in Israel is Arab. So they're kind of out of the loop. If we're looking at the Jewish population of Israel, then about 12% are ultra-Orthodox, and the rest are either Orthodox, secular, and identify in other ways. We just conducted this summer, even late summer, we conducted a poll, and it was done by an external pollster. And in our poll, 6% of the Jewish population identified as Reform and 3% as conservative. So it's not such a huge difference between us and the ultra-Orthodox community. They are, of course, and I think that you see it in New York City as well, they're so strong in political organizing that gives them a lot of power in the political system and in the political discourse.
Sure. I have one more question, and I want to take some questions, from the viewers. But you've shared the percentages, with us. It's very clear to me, dialogue and discourse aside, that this, Reform Judaism, Reform conversions being accepted, this just cannot be an issue of only North American Jews and a small segment of Israeli society. However, my perspective, and I want to hear, what you think, my perspective is that the majority of secular Israelis do not see these issues of state and religion as a critical issue for them, as you and I do, right? For our families and our community. My impression is the majority of secular Israelis want freedom from religion, right? Not freedom of religion. Pluralism and, a variety of ways to celebrate Judaism is seen as so vital in America, but I'm not sure that it is in Israel. Could you talk about this for the average secular Israeli? Is this a big deal? Conversions, in Israel, are they paying attention to these headlines as much as we are?
So I think that's a great question. In one way, I think that Israelis care deeply, deeply about issues of religion and state. They actually rank them if and again, that's external polling. They rank the more Israelis rank the division between ultra-Orthodox community and the rest of Israel as a bigger threat to the future of Israel than the Iranian nuclear bomb. Israelis are very concerned about this rift. It's been even magnified by the pandemic, in light of some of the ultra-Orthodox population refusing lockdowns and refusing some of the measures that the government has imposed on all of us. And I think that that's a huge issue for Israelis. And Israelis are experiencing the lack of religion and state in different ways. Because Israel is a majority Jewish society, then people know less Jews by choice. So Israelis would say that they are furious about the marriage situation, and that they are suffering from the fact that there's no public transportation on Shabbat, which is a result of the Orthodox monopoly. And I think that Israeli Jews and Jews in the diaspora are suffering from different symptoms of the same root cause. And one of our goals is to see how we can connect all of us in trying to address the root cause that we're all suffering from.
Sure. You know, I see so many wonderful questions. I'm gonna get to them in a moment. But, you know, I have to say, you know, this suffering, the way that this decision, you know, came down, I immediately, you know, thought about how, you know, personally this decision is landing. I'm all the way, you know, here in America. The conversions I officiate, you know, are accepted already, but, you know, not by the court. But there's such meaning in alleviating that suffering that you speak about, because again, I go back to the original dream of Zionism. And to me, this means we've really come one step closer to fulfilling the promise of creating a public space that reflects the totality of all Jewish people. Wasn't that the most basic premise of Zionism is peoplehood? And by handing over the keys of peoplehood to one segment of the population who care least about peoplehood, then we've created a real anti-Zionist situation. But I also think, you know, for you and I, Rabbi, this is a small step, and this is where I want to end and go to questions, a small step in lessening the insult that we convey to liberal rabbis and Jews. And I think it's something that Israelis could, you know, come to understand more in full, that there's a very deep hurt and anger and suffering. Here's the state of Israel, which we love and support and share the dream of, and many of our ancestors helped build. And then Israel responds to us by, you know, delegitimizing us. And I think this decision rectifies that suffering in the past, and that you talked about, you know, in a small way, right? A step in the right direction.
I think so. And I also think that it's really hard to grasp social issues in the abstract. And the best way to speak about social issues is through a personal story. And the last month, the reform movement in Israel has gotten the most exposure that we've ever had in the past. And it was through these personal stories of these Jews by choice who shared their Jewish journey, and it was so wonderful to see them represent us and who we are and what we're about. And this is exactly what we wanted and what we've dreamed about.
So I have to add from that first video, Mazel Tov to the woman who's, you know, Mazel Tov to us, and to the Iraq that does such incredible, meaningful work with real implications. Absolutely. One of our questions is about those implications. I'm going, you know, to the Q&A, and someone said, as someone in the process of a reform conversion in New York, I wanted to know the difference now and benefit of converting here versus in Israel. Do you want to take that one?
So now there's no difference. Now you're welcome to come to Israel, and we'll help you convert. But of course, if you're already in this great conversion program, then there's no, what this decision means is that there's no difference between converting in outside of Israel or in Israel.
And, you know, I'll add to that we tell our students, look, everyone needs to convert into the stream or movement that they ultimately want to live in. And now I'll just sub in country, right? If you are thinking of making Aliyah and you are going to live in Israel as a Reformed Jew, there are different things, right? The religion is the same. Being an Israeli Jew is different from being a North American Jew. And I certainly, you know, cannot educate for that fully. As the rabbi, you know, if someone came to her and said, well, I want to be a Jew in New York City, you're probably best going through the conversion process here. You know, it is not completely synonymous, although, you know, there are a lot of parallels. Let's scroll through the Q&A, Rabbi. There's a lot in here. I think one of these questions, can be answered very quickly. Any violent consequences toward, Reform Israelis considering the strong rhetoric? Have we seen attacks on Reform Jews?
So no, thank God. We know that there's a direct correlation between violent language and violent actions. And we've seen it in Israel, we've seen it around the world, which is why it's so important for us to respond. But so far, thank God, there's been no violence in the past years.
Okay, wonderful. How about this from a viewer, TK? If Reform Jews, or one convert and one Jew, are married in the United States, is their marriage legally recognized in Israel? What about LGBTQ couples? Does this recent ruling change anything about marriage? You have said they're very closely connected, but at this time, is there a change?
So before the ruling, all marriages performed outside of Israel are recognized, which is why my couples have to go to Cyprus. If you're already in New York and you want to make Aliyah, I would definitely recommend getting married in New York City or wherever you are outside of Israel. So all marriages, including LGBT same-sex marriages, are recognized in Israel, but they cannot be performed in Israel. They have to be performed out of state.
And same also the parallel to burials. Converted Jews who are converted here in Israel, the rabbinate will not allow them burial in Israel.
We have managed to. It's not as simple as burials for Jews by birth. We have been able to get that, but it's a complicated process. What IREC are working on is securing cemeteries that will be civil or reform or conservative, where people can be converted, people can be buried in the same way that they lived according to their values and not be buried by the Orthodox establishment.
I see. Okay, that's complicated. None of these are black and white. Absolutely. We have one question here about the appeals process. Is this a final ruling? Are there appeals like there are in America? I know there is talk of overruling Supreme Court decisions that the rabbis have sort of flexed muscle on. Will you tell us about next steps, what the backlash is now going to develop into?
So this decision is final. The state hasn't appealed it, and they're not going to appeal. The appeal window is closed. What the ultra-Orthodox establishment is planning, and that will really depend on the government that's established or attempting to be established as we speak, is to legislate to change the law of return. Remember that the law of return says converted, which is open, and it means to us all conversions. So right. They are trying to be the ultra-Orthodox effort is to add a caveat to only recognize some conversions. We have been lobbying and advocating with many of our partners in the left and in the right of Israel, explaining how damaging that would be, and I'm hoping that will be successful. But that will really depend on the next Israeli government and how it's structured.
Yeah, that's fair. One of our viewers, Audrey Cohen, says, what's the process for proving that you were born Jewish? I can answer that, here in the States, when one of our converts would like to make Aliyah, I know that I have to provide ample proof to their lawyers about the actual conversion. Somebody born Jewish, I'm often asked to write letters, on behalf of someone, and I usually ask to see a parent's ketubah or a bar bat mitzvah certificate, whatever, paperwork is very important in the Jewish community, any sort of proof. So I know I am willing to write these letters if I have, ample background information on their family. But Rabbi, in Israel, do you know what the definitive proof is that someone was born Jewish?
So in order to make Aliyah, the Jewish agency does a vetting process, which usually is very similar to what you've described, Rabbi. They're asking to see ketubas from parents. In the U.S., it's relatively simple because people usually have that type of documentation. But we are helping Jewish immigrants from around the world, and in some of the former Soviet Union countries, these documentations are much harder to get. Sometimes they use tombstones of grandparents, right. Documentation. In Ethiopia, it's very difficult. There's very little documentation, and we're trying to help every person who wants to come to Israel to fulfill that, right? And sometimes it's very creative. You take you signed affidavits from neighbors. It's a very difficult process for some people. Mostly in the U.S., it's pretty simple.
Yes. You can have a letter from a rabbi, a synagogue, yes. Someone who's been involved with your family. Of course, it helps if I've officiated their, wedding and then baby namings.
Or it's happened in a congregation that we recognize. Yes.
Somebody was asking, and I know the answer, but I would love you to expand. Is it only Central Synagogue, Center for Exploring Judaism converts, that are recognized, or is it converts from different synagogues that you recognize as, being legitimate?
The ruling from 1989 is that every synagogue that is recognized that is part of the World Union for Progressive Judaism. Mm-hmm. In the U.S., there are about 900 synagogues that are under that banner, or recognized by Masorti Olami, which is the umbrella organization of the conservative movement. Any conversion performed in those synagogues is recognized for the purpose of Aliyah. Mm. So it's a broad range.
Mm. And I'm scrolling through. I think that we have answered most, and we always end at 5 till the hour. So I would like, in these 60 seconds, I just want to lift you up a little bit and honor the work that you've done. One of our viewers commented, anytime Iraq, is in the news, you are really leading the charge along with Anat Hoffman, and the work that you do is just absolutely incredible, with implications, and we are cheering you on every step. As I said, we are in lockstep, with your values. And what would you say, what would be your message to people who are considering joining the Jewish people here, in New York through Central, or anyone joining us, about how we could better support our liberal community in Israel?
So, one of the things that we always ask in the conversion court in Israel is we ask people to speak about the biblical story that they love most. Mm. And the biblical story that I love most is the story of Jacob and Rachel, and how romantic their love was. And one of my favorite psukim, one of my favorite sentences about that is, you may remember that Jacob had to work 14 years of hard labor. So he had to work for 7 years for Leah, and then he had to work for another 7 years for Rachel. And the biblical story tells us, these 14 years of hard labor, for Jacob, it was like a few years because he loved her so much. And a lot of the work that we do at Iraq takes that long. And for us, that's a work of love. And we're building the Jewish state and the Jewish future together for all of us, Jews by choice and Jews by birth. And we're all partners in this work, which is sometimes, it feels like hard labor, but ultimately in the space of Jewish history, it's like a few days. So I want to thank you for your support. Here the link to sign up to the IRAC newsletter. We share our news of the work that we do every week, and there are plenty of opportunities for online activism. So I encourage you to sign up. It's short and it's interesting, and it's always about important issues happening in Israel. And this is the future we're building together, and everybody who joins us is important in this. So I want to, everybody who's thinking about becoming part of our people, I want to thank you for considering it, and I want to encourage you on your journey. And I value the choice that you're making in becoming one of us.
So beautiful. Rabbi, thank you so much. It was wonderful to meet you, to dialogue like this, especially in the middle of Pesach. Again, we are so on brand with the messages of redemption of oppressed groups. It was wonderful to be with you. I hope that we have many opportunities ahead to dialogue like this. And on behalf of our whole community, thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Know that you have partners across the sea.
That's so significant for me to hear. Thank you so much. Happy Pesach.
Happy Pesach. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.